Welcome back to another story. And if you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we tell the kind of tales that stay with you long after the last word. Today's story is about a woman who saw what everyone else refused to look at. A creature that waited where no creature should have been able to wait. And a truth buried so deep beneath 3 centuries of silence that the people guarding it had long since forgotten they were guarding anything at all. This is a story about patience. About the kind of endurance that outlasts stone and law, and the comfortable lies that powerful people tell themselves at night. And it is, above all else, a love story. Not the kind that arrives easily. The kind that has to be excavated from the earth with both hands. The kind that costs something real. Stay with me. This one is worth every second. The Ashevale Pack territories stretched across 400 square miles of dense old-growth forest, broken by granite ridgelines and cold, black rivers that ran fast even in summer. It was the kind of land that demanded respect, the kind that did not forgive carelessness or arrogance, and for the most part, the Ashevale wolves understood this. They had built their settlements carefully, their boundary markers set deep into the earth at intervals mapped and remapped over generations. Their patrol routes adjusted seasonally to account for the way the forest breathed and shifted with the years. It was a well-ordered territory, and the Ashevale elders took considerable pride in that order. Order was, in fact, the thing they valued above almost everything else. It was the justification they reached for most readily when hard decisions needed to be made, when sacrifices needed to be explained, when questions needed to be stopped before they became inconvenient. Order. Stability, the continuation of what had always been. These were the principles carved above the door of the Elder Hall, and they were the principles invoked whenever someone suggested that perhaps things could be done differently. Sarah Voss had stopped suggesting things could be done differently approximately 6 years before this story begins, not because she stopped believing it, but because she had learned, with the patient and thorough disillusionment of someone who genuinely tried, that suggestion accomplished nothing in a system designed to absorb suggestion and return it to you as evidence of your own naivety. She was 28 years old, lean and brown from years of outdoor work, with dark eyes that had a quality of seeing more than she commented on, and hands that were always slightly scarred from the boundary work that occupied most of her waking hours. She had been a pack tracker since she was 17, assigned to the Northern Territories, which were the most demanding and the least prestigious. The Northern Territories were where the old forest thickened to the point that even experienced wolves moved carefully, where the granite ridgelines created navigation challenges that required patience and skill, and where the boundary markers had a tendency to shift in ways that the official maps never quite caught up with. Sarah had been mapping those shifts for 11 years. She had submitted 47 detailed reports to the Elder Council over the course of her service. She had received acknowledgement for exactly 3 of them, and those acknowledgments had been form letters generated by the administrative office that handled routine correspondence. She was not bitter about this exactly. Bitterness implies a wound that is still raw, and what Sarah had developed over 11 years of invisible labor was something more like a very precise and functional detachment. She did the work, because the work mattered regardless of whether anyone recognized that it mattered. The boundaries she mapped protected real wolves living real lives on the other side of her survey lines. The anomalies she documented in her reports had, in several cases, prevented territorial disputes that would have cost blood. The fact that no one with authority ever read closely enough to connect her documentation to those prevented disasters was not her problem to solve. She showed up, she mapped, she recorded, she submitted, and then she went back out into the old forest and did it again. The bear appeared for the first time on a Tuesday in late October, which was the season when the Northern Territories went into a particular kind of stillness that Sarah had come to associate with the old forest's version of breath-holding. The deciduous trees had dropped their leaves, and the pines stood dark and silent, and the ground was covered in a deep mat of fallen needles that muffled every sound, so that moving through the forest in late October felt like moving through something that was listening very carefully. She had been checking the boundary markers along the ridge she called the Spine, a 7-mile granite formation that formed the natural northern border of Ashevale Territory. When she came over the last rise and stopped, The bear was standing at the edge of the tree line on the far side of the boundary, approximately 40 feet from the nearest marker stone. It was the largest bear she had ever seen. Not large the way that bears are large. That comfortable biological largeness of an animal that has grown to the upper end of its species range. This was large the way that old things are large. The way that something, which has been present for a very long time, accretes a kind of weight that you feel before you understand it. It was standing still, which was itself unusual, bears being creatures that are generally in motion. But this one was simply standing and facing her, and its eyes, which should have been the small, dark eyes of an animal, were something else entirely. Sarah stood and looked at it for a long time. It stood and looked at her. Neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the bear turned and walked back into the trees on the far side of the boundary, and Sarah let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and stood in the late October silence for several more minutes before she took out her field notebook and began to write. She noted the location, the time, the estimated size, the unusual stillness, and the quality of the eyes, which she described in her notes as showing cognitive engagement inconsistent with standard ursine behavior. She also noted, because she noted everything, a detail that she had not consciously registered until she began to write. The bear had markings in its fur. Not natural markings, not the pale chest patches or faded saddles that bears sometimes carried, but something that looked, from 40 feet away in the failing late afternoon light, like deliberate symbols. Lines and curves pressed into the fur in patterns too regular to be random. She noted this. She drew a rough sketch of what she could remember, and then she did what she always did, which was to file the observation in her ongoing survey record and continue her work. She saw the bear again 4 days later, in the same location, at approximately the same time of day, and again 3 days after that, by the fourth sighting, which occurred in early November when the first light snow had come to the spine, and the tracks it left behind were clearly not the tracks of any bear she had ever seen, with a depth and weight that suggested something far heavier than its visible mass. Sarah had begun to feel the particular focused attention that came to her when a pattern was revealing itself. She did not know yet what the pattern meant, but she knew it was there, and she knew it was important, and so she did what she always did with important things. She went to the archive. The Ashevale Pack archive was housed in the basement of the Elder Hall, in a series of rooms that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular dry cold that comes from stone walls that have never fully warmed. Sarah had spent a great deal of time in the archive over the years, because the archive was where you went when the official maps disagreed with the territory as it actually existed, and in her experience, the official maps almost always disagreed with the territory in ways that were instructive. The archivist knew her by sight, and left her alone, which was the professional courtesy she valued most. She worked through the older catalogs, the ones predating the current administrative system, looking for anything that matched the markings she had sketched in her notebook. She found it on her third visit, in a collection of documents that had been labeled Administrative Overflow and filed without index in the back corner of the third room. The collection had clearly not been opened in decades, possibly longer. The papers were fragile in the particular way of things that have been stored in cold and damp and then forgotten, and she handled them carefully, reading by the light of the lamp she had brought because the electrical fixtures back here were unreliable. She was 3 hours into the collection when she found a document that made her sit very still for a long time. It was a record of proceedings from a council session dated 312 years ago, written in the formal script of that era, which Sarah could read because she had taught herself the old handwriting styles, because they appeared in boundary documents, and boundary documents were her professional territory. The record detailed the sentencing and sealing of a figure identified as Calum Dre, described in the document as the last keeper of the northern boundary, a designation she did not recognize, and identified by bloodline as primordial bear kindred, a classification she had read about only in theoretical texts. The charges against him were enumerated in the cold language of institutional proceedings: unauthorized interference in council decisions, refusal to submit boundary authority to the newly consolidated elder system, preservation of prohibited records, The sentence was transformation seal, which the document described with a clinical precision that made her feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the archive temperature. A transformation seal was a binding that did not kill, but did not truly permit life either. A form of imprisonment that locked a shifter between their forms, conscious enough to know what had been done to them, animal enough to be unable to speak of it. The record noted, in a postscript written in a different hand, that the sealing had been successfully completed at the northern spine boundary, and that the subject had been confirmed bound on the 4th day following the ceremony. There was no record of any subsequent proceedings, no release order, no review, nothing. 312 years of nothing. And the seal marks, carefully illustrated in the margin of the document by whoever had recorded the proceeding, were the same marks she had sketched from the bear's fur. If you are feeling that particular combination of horror and urgency that I am feeling describing this to you, then you understand exactly where Sarah was sitting in that cold archive with a lamp in her hand and a 300-year-old document in front of her. Drop a comment below because I want to know. At what point in this story did you realize what was actually happening? Because Sarah, to her immense credit, understood immediately. She did not need more evidence. She did not go through a stage of rationalization or convenient doubt. She understood, and understanding filled her with something so large and so cold and so furious that she sat for nearly 10 minutes before she trusted herself to stand up without her hands shaking. She made copies of the relevant documents. She was thorough about it because she was thorough about everything, and because some part of her already understood that she was going to need evidence that could not be dismissed. She took the copies back to her quarters and spent the rest of the night reading everything she could find about primordial bear shifters, transformation seals, and the Northern Boundary Keeper designation. By morning, she had a clearer picture of what had been done, and it was worse than her initial understanding had suggested. Primordial bear shifters were not simply large shifters with exceptional abilities. They were, according to the oldest texts she could find, entities of genuine supernatural lineage, descended from the first bearers of territorial power in the Old World, whose connection to the land they protected was so fundamental that severing it did not simply imprison them, it damaged the land itself. The Northern Spine had always had anomalies in her surveys. She had documented them for 11 years. She had assumed they were geological. She had been wrong. She went back to the spine the next morning, earlier than usual. And this time she did not wait at the boundary. She crossed it. This was, technically, a violation of pack protocol. Trackers did not cross established boundaries without elder authorization. Sarah had, over 11 years, developed a very refined understanding of which protocols existed to serve genuine purposes and which existed to serve the comfort of people who preferred not to be surprised, and she had made her peace with violating the latter category when the situation warranted it. The situation warranted it. She crossed the boundary line and walked through the old trees on the other side, following the direction the bear had gone on its last departure, reading the ground with the skill of someone who had spent 11 years learning to read this particular kind of forest. The tracks were deep and regular, and led her through half a mile of dense pine to a clearing she had not known was there, which meant it had not been on any of her surveys, which meant it was either new, which was impossible, or it had been somehow absent from every reading she had taken in 11 years of thorough documentation. The bear was in the clearing. It was lying on its side near the center, and in the pale November light, it was even larger than she had thought, vast and dark, and still in a way that made her breath catch because for one terrible moment she thought it was dead. Then it breathed, a deep, slow rise and fall of its enormous rib cage, and its eyes opened. Those eyes again, cognitive, present, looking at her with something that was unmistakably recognition. Sarah crouched down to its level, because she had been reading about transformation seals all night, and she understood that it could hear her, that somewhere inside whatever it had been reduced to, there was something that had been listening to the world for 3 centuries, and she spoke quietly and directly the way she spoke to everything she encountered in the field, without performance, without false comfort, but with the genuine respect she gave to all things that deserved it. She told it that she had found the record. She told it that she understood what had been done. She told it that she was going to find a way to undo it, and that she needed it to be patient a little longer. And she said this last part with a particular quality in her voice that acknowledged what an obscene thing it was to ask patience of something that had already been waiting for 300 years. The bear made a sound that was not quite a sound an animal makes. It was low and deep, and it moved through her chest like a bell struck very close to where she was standing. And then, with a deliberateness that was entirely unlike animal movement, it extended one massive paw toward her and held it there. Sarah looked at the paw. She looked at the marks in the fur, which up close were not just marks, but raised and structured patterns, like script written in 3 dimensions, lines that glowed faintly in the low light with a luminescence that had nothing to do with reflection. She reached out and placed her hand against the marks. The world did not explode. Nothing dramatic happened in the way that dramatic things happen in stories where the universe wants to make its point clearly. What happened instead was quieter and more profound. A warmth moved through her palm and up her arm and into her chest, and she felt something shift in the air around the clearing, a pressure releasing that she had not known was there. The way you do not know a sound has been constant until it stops. The light in the marks intensified briefly, then settled to something steadier. The bear exhaled, long and slow, and in that exhalation she heard something that sounded, at the edge of hearing, almost like a word. She went back to her quarters and wrote for 4 hours straight. Not a report this time. Not a survey record. A case. A documented, evidenced, formally structured case, with copies of the archive records attached, with her own 11 years of anomaly documentation attached, with a timeline and an analysis and a section on the legal and ethical implications of what the founding council had done and what every subsequent council had chosen not to undo. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, precisely and without sentimentality. But there was something underneath the precision that she had not put into documentation before, a quality of personal investment that she usually kept separate from her professional work. She could not keep it separate this time. This time, it was not possible. She submitted the case to the Elder Council that afternoon. She received within 2 hours a response that she had not entirely anticipated, although perhaps she should have. The response was not a form letter. It was a summons. The Elder Hall's main chamber was a room designed to convey authority through architecture, with high ceilings and carved stone, and the accumulated weight of centuries of serious decisions made in its vicinity. The 5 current elders sat at the crescent table that faced the chamber entrance, and when Sarah walked in, she understood immediately from the quality of their stillness that they had known about the bear. Not recently. Not as a surprise discovery that her report had brought to light. They had known for a long time. The particular way that Elder Halveth, the head of the council, was not quite meeting her eyes, told her this as clearly as if it had been written in the same careful script as the 300-year-old document in her folder. She laid her case on the table. She did not perform deference, because she had never found it useful, and because the situation did not warrant it. She summarized her findings in the direct professional manner that was her natural register, watching their faces as she spoke. Elder Halveth's face did not change. The face of Elder Vance, the youngest of the 5, and the one she had occasionally thought was slightly less invested in institutional self-protection than the others, flickered once, quickly, with something that might have been dismay. The others were stone. When she finished, Elder Halveth spoke. His voice was measured and kind, in the particular way that institutional power is kind when it is preparing to deny something that cannot be denied. And he told her that her dedication to her work was admirable, that the archive materials she had found were interesting historical documents, and that the creature at the spine was a naturally occurring ursine of unusual size that had been under observation by the council for several seasons and had been determined to be a threat to territorial security. He told her that a hunting party was being assembled and would depart in 3 days, and he thanked her for her report. Sarah looked at Elder Halveth for a long moment. Then she looked at Elder Vance, who was looking at the table. Then she picked up her documents and walked out of the Elder Hall. She went back to the archive. This is the part of the story that I want you to pay attention to, because it matters. because it is the part where Sarah makes the choice that defines everything that follows. And it is not a dramatic choice. It is not a moment of obvious heroism. It is just a woman sitting in a cold archive room going back to the work, because the work was not done. She had 3 days. She knew what the hunting party would do when it reached the spine, because she knew how transformation seals worked now, which was to say that killing the bound form did not release the bound entity. It simply ended both simultaneously. 3 centuries of consciousness ended because the people who had imprisoned it could not afford to have its testimony heard. She was not going to let that happen. She worked through the night, following a thread she had found in the older administrative records, a reference to a document called the Boundary Compact, which predated the Ashevale Council itself and appeared to have been a foundational agreement governing the territories before the pack consolidation. She found it in the deepest part of the archive, in a room she was fairly certain had not been entered in her lifetime, still sealed in the original container in which it had been stored. She broke the seal, which was the second protocol violation she committed that week, and read. The Boundary Compact was more than a territorial agreement. It was, in the language of its time, a covenant of custodianship, an acknowledgement that the territories were held in trust by the packs that occupied them, but that the fundamental authority over the old boundaries resided in the keeper lineages, of which the northern boundary keepers, the dry line, were the oldest. The compact included, in its final clauses, a provision for the release of any bound keeper, which required the testimony of a boundary witness, a pack member with documented survey knowledge of the territory, who could attest that the keeper's work had been left undone, and that the territory bore evidence of that absence. 11 years of anomaly documentation, 47 submitted reports, evidence of a territory that had been trying, for 3 centuries, to tell someone who was paying close enough attention that something was deeply wrong with its northern boundary. She had the testimony. She had always had the testimony. She just had not known what it was testimony for. The release ceremony described in the compact was not a complicated ritual. It required the presence of the boundary witness at the sealing site, the formal recitation of the compact's release clause, and physical contact with the seal marks. She had already done the last part. The rest she could do. What she could not do was do it before the hunting party departed, because the hunting party was departing in 3 days, and the compact's release procedure required a full moon cycle to take effect, which meant she had approximately 26 days. She needed to keep him alive for 26 days in a territory that had just been designated as active hunting ground. Sarah closed the archive documents, replaced them where she had found them, kept her copies in the waterproof case she used for field documents, and went back to her quarters to pack. She was gone before dawn, headed north, carrying 3 weeks of supplies and the full weight of 11 years of knowing this territory better than anyone else alive. If you are the kind of person who stays up past midnight because a story has you and you cannot put it down, now would be a great time to hit that like button, because this is not even close to the end, and what comes next is going to earn it. Because here is the thing about the northern territories that Sarah knew, and the Elder Council's hunters did not. She had mapped them. She had mapped every trail, and every ridge, and every hidden valley, and every clearing that the official surveys had missed. And the official surveys had missed a great deal, because the official surveys were conducted by people who were following maps rather than reading the land. She knew where the old forest thickened to the point that even experienced trackers lost their direction. She knew where the granite ridgelines created acoustic anomalies that distorted sound and made distance judgment unreliable. She knew, specifically, where a very large bear could shelter and remain effectively invisible to anyone who had not spent 11 years learning the exact vocabulary of that particular piece of ground. She found the bear in the same clearing as before, lying in the thin snow with its head up, and those eyes tracking her as she came through the tree line. She settled down across from it and spread out her maps between them, which was an absurd thing to do, showing maps to a bear, except that it was not a bear, not really, not inside, and the quality of attention it brought to the maps when she explained what she was. Planning told her everything she needed to know about the mind behind the eyes. It understood her, Not perfectly, not with the full comprehension of language, but enough. When she pointed to the routes she intended to use, it followed the movement of her finger. When she described the timeline and held up her fingers to indicate the days, it blinked once, slowly, in a way that felt like acknowledgement. When she explained that she needed it to trust her and follow her guidance for the next 26 days, it looked at her for a long moment in that particular way it had. The way that was too sustained and too knowing for an animal, and then it stood up slowly and waited. She moved the bear for the first time on the second day, when the hunting party's preliminary scouts reached the spine. She had anticipated their route, because she had written the standard patrol and hunting protocols for the Northern Territories in year 3 of her service, when the previous documentation had become inaccurate, and Elder Halveth had needed someone to update it, and she had chosen her for the task because she was competent, and he had not considered that a person who writes the protocols understands exactly how to work around them. She took the bear through a series of routes that her own maps indicated, but the official documentation did not, moving in the hours between first light and mid-morning, when the patrol scouts were occupied with their own boundary checks, and the forest had its own particular quality of busy silence that provided cover. The bear moved with a silence that was itself extraordinary, something that she noted professionally in the same part of her mind that noted everything. That an animal of that size moving that quietly was further evidence of the supernatural nature of its origin, because physics did not fully account for it. They settled in a hidden valley on the second day, a geological fold in the ridgeline that Sarah had documented in year 4 as a significant territorial anomaly, in which the council had never acted on because it was inaccessible by any of the official trails. She had packed for 3 weeks. She had planned for cold and for wet, and for the particular kind of discomfort that comes from living outdoors in November in old-growth forest, and she settled into the work of keeping them both alive with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. She built a shelter that was small and efficient. She set snares for supplemental food. She kept detailed notes in her field journal, because she was Sarah Voss, and she did not stop documenting even in situations that most people would not have thought of as documentation situations. And because the documentation mattered, the documentation was going to matter very much when this was over. On the third night, lying in the shelter while the bear settled just outside its entrance with its enormous bulk serving, she realized, as windbreak, she became aware that something had changed in the quality of the silence. Not threatening, just different. She came out of the shelter and found the bear sitting up and facing east, and the marks on its fur were glowing with a steadiness they had not had before, not the occasional dim flicker she had observed, but a sustained and structured luminescence that was, she recognized after a moment, brighter near her hands. She sat down next to it, which was something she would not have predicted herself doing a month ago. Sitting in the snow next to a primordial-bound shifter in the middle of a hidden valley, and looked at the marks. She reached out and traced one of the patterns very lightly with her finger, and felt the warmth again. The same warmth she had felt the first time she touched them, but deeper now, more organized, moving through her hand and up her arm in a path that was not random but structured, like it was looking for something. "You have been alone for a very long time," she said, not really expecting a response, just saying it because it was true, and because the true thing seemed worth saying. The bear made that sound again, the low, deep one that moved through her chest, but this time it was different. This time, at the very edge of what could be heard, she was almost certain she could make out a word. 2 syllables. Her name. She sat in the snow for a long time after that, not moving. The hunting party found the clearing on the 5th day, which was a day earlier than she had anticipated, which meant either that someone in the party was a better tracker than their reputation suggested, or that someone in the council's network had been watching her movements. She had already moved. She was already 3 miles north, in a second location she had identified as viable, but the hunting party's early arrival recalibrated her timeline, and she spent the 6th day doing something she usually disliked, which was planning for multiple contingencies simultaneously. She mapped out 4 more potential locations, ranked by accessibility and concealment, and created a rotation schedule that would keep them moving without creating a predictable pattern. By day 7, she had established a rhythm, and rhythm was where she was most comfortable. Rhythm was where the work became automatic, and the deeper parts of her mind were freed to think about other things. She thought about the boundary compact, and about the release clause, and about the specific language required for the testimony. She thought about what the territory had been doing for 300 years, the anomalies that were not geological, the boundary shifts that she had documented meticulously, and that were, she now understood, the land's own record of an absence, the physical evidence of a custodianship that had been interrupted mid-sentence. She thought about the 47 reports she had submitted, and the 3 that had been acknowledged, and she felt something sharp and clarifying in the recognition that even when working in total institutional invisibility, she had been building the case that was going to set this right. And she thought about the bear, which was harder to think about systematically, because the bear was not systematic. The bear was something that resisted the organizational framework she usually used for understanding, something that moved through the formal structures of her thinking like water finding the level beneath the floor. On the 8th day, it rained, a cold November rain that turned to sleet in the afternoon and made the forest floor treacherous and the shelter inadequate, and they huddled together in the lee of a granite outcropping that Sarah had identified as viable emergency shelter, the bear taking up most of the available space while she pressed against its flank for warmth in a way that was purely practical, and which she noted in her field journal as purely practical, because she was Sarah Voss and she documented things. The warmth. Coming off the bear was extraordinary. Not animal warmth, but something more fundamental. Something that felt like standing near a hearth that had been burning for a very long time, and she slept against its side in the sleet. Dark, and felt, with a clarity she could not quite articulate, that she was in the safest place she had ever been. She woke to stillness, and to the bear watching her, and in the pale gray morning light, the marks on its fur were very bright, and she sat up and looked at them, with the eye of someone who had been studying them for over a week, who had been reading about them in the old texts, who had built, in the way she built everything, a detailed technical understanding of what she was looking at. The seal was weakening. It had been weakening since the first time she touched it, not dramatically, not in any way that could be observed on a day-to-day basis, but across 8 days the change was measurable, which meant that the contact was doing what the compact had suggested it would do, that the boundary witness's connection to the territory was, slowly and structurally, undermining the seal's foundation. Good. Ahead of schedule, even. She told him this. She had started speaking to him more naturally over the past few days. Not the formal explanatory address she had used initially, but the kind of conversation she held with herself when she was working through problems in the field. Low and continuous, and thinking aloud. She did not know how much of it reached him through the seal's interference. But she thought more than nothing, because the way he listened had changed, had become less the careful, focused attention of something translating across a barrier, and more the relaxed attentiveness of someone following along. She told him the seal was weakening on schedule. She told him 18 more days. She told him she had 4 backup locations and adequate supplies, and that the hunting party had lost her trail twice in the past 3 days, which was professionally satisfying. She heard the low sound from him that she had come to associate with something like amusement, and felt the warmth move up her arm where it was resting against his side. "I have been wondering," she said, watching the marks, "what it was like, the waiting." She paused. "You do not have to tell me. I am just thinking about it." The bear was quiet for a moment. Then it did something she had not seen it do before, which was to lift one of its enormous forepaws and rest it very carefully on top of her hand. The weight of it was something that should have been alarming, and instead was the opposite, was the specific and precise opposite of alarming. And she sat with that weight on her hand, and the warmth moving through her skin, and felt the answer to her question not in words, but in something older and more complete than words, a wave of duration that had no adequate translation into language. 300 years of the same ridge and the same sky and the same trees growing and dying and growing again, and the same cold and the same dark, and underneath all of it, constant and undimming, the memory of what it was to be whole. She did not cry. She was Sarah Voss, but she sat for a very long time before she trusted herself to move. Now I need to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment before you answer it in the comments, because it matters. How long do you think you could wait for something if you were certain it was right? Not certain it would happen. Not certain of the outcome. Just certain that the waiting was the correct thing to do. Leave me your answer below, because this story is asking that question to everyone in it. And the answers are interesting. By day 12, the hunting party had been reinforced. She observed this from a high point on the eastern ridge, watching their camp through the small glass she carried for long-distance observation, and counted 8 hunters where there had been 6, and noted, with a professional displeasure that she did not let affect her planning, that one of the new arrivals was Devon Crow, who was the best tracker in the pack, and who she had, in a more socially integrated period of her career, trained. She had trained him well, which was now a complication. She spent the evening recalculating her routes, because Davon would not make the same assumptions as the rest of the party, would read the forest the way she had taught him to read it, rather than the way the official protocols suggested, and this meant 3 of her 4 remaining viable locations were potentially compromised. She was not worried. Worried was not a state she found useful. She was recalculating, which was different, which was what you did when the ground changed under your feet. She was also, on day 12, dealing with something she had not factored into her planning because she had not known to factor it in, which was that the weakening seal was having effects she had not anticipated. The bear was larger in the mornings, consistently, by measurably more than the evening before, not in the gradual biological way of an animal eating well, but in the sudden discontinuous way of a form reasserting itself against compression. The marks were brighter and more structured each day, and she herself was changing in ways she had to note in her journal, with the same precision she brought to everything, a heightened awareness of the territory around her that went beyond her trained tracking. Skill, a sense of the land that was less sensory and more immediate, as though the boundaries she had spent 11 years mapping were now available to her not as data, but as something closer to proprioception, the way you know where your own hand is in the dark. She understood, from the compact's language, what this was. The boundary witness was not simply a legal designation. It was a functional one. The contact with the seal was activating something in her that had been latent, something in her own bloodline that she had never had reason to investigate, and the careful genealogical references she found when she went back through her family's records in her memory suggested, uncomfortably and specifically, that she was not an Ashvale wolf by origin as cleanly as she had always assumed. Her mother's line, which she had never mapped in detail because it had not seemed relevant, went north and old and connected, she thought now, to something that predated the current pack structure. She noted this. She added it to the case file in the back of her mind. She would deal with it when there was time. On day 15, something happened that she had not planned for. She was at the northeast location, the last viable one on her list, settling in for the night, when the bear went still in a particular way that was not its usual stillness. It was alert, with its head up and its nostrils working, and the marks on its fur were going through a rapid cycling that she had not seen before, brightening and dimming in a sequence that felt urgent. She trusted this. She had learned, over 15 days, to trust the information coming off the seal marks the way she trusted her own survey readings, carefully, precisely, and without sentiment. Something was coming. Something specific and significant, and soon. She gathered the camp. She moved, and she had been moving for approximately 20 minutes through the night forest when she heard them behind her. Not the hunting party, not Devon. Crow's professional quiet, but something else. Something that was making noise because it was not trying to be silent. Something large and multiple and coming fast through the trees from the west. Not hunters. Pack wolves, running as pack wolves, without human pretense or human patience. Someone had decided that the careful hunting approach was taking too long and had authorized a different kind of hunt. Sarah stopped. She looked at the bear. The bear looked back at her. And in the dark, the marks, were very bright, and the eyes were very present, and there was, in the quality of its attention, something that she could only describe as a question, as deliberate and specific as any question asked in language. She heard the wolves behind her, closer now, and she calculated her options with the same rapid precision she used for everything, and she understood that her options had narrowed to one. She could not outrun pack wolves in the forest at night, not over distance. But the release clause of the compact did not require the full moon cycle if the testimony was complete, and the witness and the subject were in immediate mortal danger, because someone, 3 centuries ago, had thought to include that provision, had thought to consider that the conditions for release might be urgent, and she did not know if she should be grateful to that person or furious with everyone who had come after and chosen not to be that careful. She stopped running. She turned to face the bear. She opened the field case and took out the documents, and she began to speak, not loudly, not with performance, but clearly and precisely in the formal language of the compact's release clause. Her voice steady, and her hands steady, and her eyes on the marks that were cycling through their urgent rhythm. She spoke the testimony. 11 years of it, compressed into its essential truth, that the northern boundary of this territory had borne for 3 centuries the evidence of a custodianship interrupted, that she had documented that evidence in 47 reports, that the land itself attested to the absence, that she as boundary witness formally and completely attested to the same, that the terms of the Boundary Compact's emergency release provision were met. She placed both hands on the marks. The forest went white, not a visual white, not light in the ordinary sense, but a white that was felt rather than seen, a total and complete cessation of resistance, the way a held breath releases, the way a wound that has been held closed finally, at cost, gives way. She felt it move through her from her hands outward, and she heard, from a great distance that was also somehow directly in front of her, a sound that was not the sound of an animal. That was something she would spend a long time afterward trying to find adequate language for, and never quite manage. The seal broke the way old stone breaks, not shattering but resolving, falling apart along lines that had been there from the beginning, and the white was everywhere, and the warmth was everywhere. And then there was a different kind of stillness. The wolves had stopped. The forest had stopped. Everything had stopped. And when the white resolved itself back into ordinary night and ordinary trees and ordinary cold air, there was a man standing where the bear had been. He was tall, substantially taller than anyone she knew, with the kind of build that suggested not the current pack's aesthetic of lean athletic mass, but something older and denser, a structural presence that matched the weight the ground had been registering for 15 days. His hair was dark and long enough to be disorganized from 3 centuries of not having been cut, and the marks, the seal marks, were present on his skin in the places they had been on the fur, down his arms and across his chest and up along his neck, still faintly luminescent, fading slowly as she watched. He was not dressed, which was a direct practical problem she addressed by removing her outer jacket and handing it to him without comment, because she was Sarah Voss, and practical problems were solved as they arose. He took it, which suggested motor function intact, and held it for a moment before she directed gently that it was intended to be worn, and he put it on with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the relationship between intention and action. He was looking at her. His eyes were the same eyes, cognitively present and very deep, and holding a quality of attention that she had been on the receiving end of for 15 days, and which still had the effect, she noted professionally, of making her want to take a careful breath. "Sarah Voss," he said. His voice was deep and rough from 3 centuries of disuse. The consonants imprecise, but the name entirely clear, and the way he said it was not a question, and not a statement, but something that occupied the space between them where the seal had been. Something that had been waiting, as long as everything else had been waiting, and she heard in it every time the low sound had moved through her chest in the dark, and every time the warmth had moved up her arm, and every time she had woken against his side in the cold, and felt the most specific and inexplicable safety she had ever felt. "Yes," she said, because it seemed like the right answer to whatever question had actually been asked. Behind them, the pack wolves had stopped completely. She turned to look at them, 6 wolves standing at the edge of the trees with their own version of frozen attention. And she understood that they were not frozen by threat. The primordial bond was not that simple, but by something more fundamental, the same quality that had stopped the forest. The recognition that the ground had just shifted in a way that did not permit easy continuation of previous business. She looked at them until they looked away, one by one, and then she turned back to the man who had been waiting for 300 years, and said, practically, that they needed to move before the hunting party leadership arrived, because leadership would have more authority to make decisions that the ground's current uncertainty could not stop. And he nodded once, carefully, still recalibrating the relationship between intention and action, and they moved north together through the old trees. Subscribe if you are still with me, because I would not be telling you this story if it ended in the forest. The best part is what happens next. The next 11 days were the most precisely documented 11 days of Sarah's professional life, which was saying something, because Sarah's professional documentation was already exceptional. She kept meticulous records of everything. Caelim's physical restoration, which proceeded quickly once the seal was fully broken. The primordial physiology reasserting itself with an efficiency that suggested it had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. His language recovery, which was slower, 3 centuries of forced silence not resolving overnight, but which had a quality of purposeful methodical progression that reminded her, not inaccurately, of her own approach to difficult problems. The territorial responses she began to observe as they moved through the northern spine, which were measurable and specific and documented thoroughly. The land recognizing its keeper with the quiet structural relief of a system restored to function. She also documented herself because she was honest about what was happening in her own system, and honesty required notation. The awareness she had developed during the contact with the seal was not fading. If anything, it was clarifying, becoming more organized as her own latent ability adjusted to the new information, and what had started as an enhanced sense of the territory's edge was becoming something she had no existing vocabulary for, a fluency with the boundary that was not trained knowledge, but something older, something inherited. She was beginning to understand her mother's line. She was beginning to understand why she'd been drawn to boundary work when others with equal ability had pursued more prestigious assignments, why 11 years of invisible labor in the hardest territories had felt not like sacrifice but like home. Caelim was, as he recovered language, a careful and precise speaker. He did not use words he was not certain of, and he did not speak more than the situation required. And he listened. With the same quality of sustained attention she had spent 15 days on the receiving end of, which she was still adjusting to, because being listened to that fully was not something she had significant experience with. He asked questions that were specific and showed that he was tracking not just her words, but the architecture beneath them, the organizational logic of how she thought. He answered questions the same way. They built, in the 11 days before she walked back into the Ashvale, settlement with Caelim at her side, and the full documented case in her field pack, a conversation that was ongoing and cumulative, and which she was fairly certain was unlike any other conversation she had ever had. On the 9th day of those 11, while she was working through a section of the compact's language that she was not entirely certain she had translated correctly, he sat across from her and watched her work for a while, and then said, in the careful, measured way he spoke, that he wanted to ask her something, and that she should tell him if it was not a question she wanted to answer. She said that was fine. He said, "When did you decide to come across the boundary the first time?" "Before you found the document." "What made you do it?" She thought about this honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. "I had the data," she said finally. 11 years of data, saying something was wrong that nobody was correcting, and I had watched you for 4 weeks, and you were patient in a way that nothing afraid is patient. Things that are afraid are always calculating escape. You were just, she paused, waiting, and I needed to know what you were waiting for. He was quiet for a moment. You were the first person, he said, in 300 years, who looked long enough to see that. She wrote it in the field journal. She wrote it in the field journal because she documented everything, and because it was true, and because she thought that true things deserved a record. They walked back into the Ashevale settlement on a morning in late November, 17 days after she had left, and the settlement stopped around them the way the forest had stopped. She walked to the elder hall with Calum at her height behind her, and the case in her hands, and the full documentary record, and the boundary compact, and 3 centuries of receipts, and she did not knock. She walked in, and she laid the case on the table, and she stood in front of the 5 elders, and she said, without preface, that she was there to present the formal testimony required by the Boundary Compact for the restoration of the Northern Boundary Keepership, that the compact was a founding document of the Ashevale territories and superseded the current council structure's authority in all matters pertaining to boundary custodianship, and that she had brought a certified copy for Elder Halveth's review and intended to file the original with the territorial record. Elder Halveth looked at the man standing behind her for a long time. Then he looked at Sarah. Then he said, very quietly, that what she was proposing would require a full council review, and that pending that review, there is nothing pending. Sarah said, the compact does not permit review. It permits compliance. Here is the documentation. Here is the testimony. Here is the keeper. The review period ended 312 years ago. Elder Vance, who was looking at Calum with the expression of someone who has been told a story all their life and has just met the person the story was about, said quietly, she's right. The silence that followed was the specific silence of institutional power, adjusting to the discovery that it is smaller than it thought, and Sarah stood in that silence with her case on the table and let it last as long as it needed to. Calum stood at her back with the quality of presence that was, she had come to understand, not intimidation, but simple reality, the reality of something that had been waiting long enough that its patience had become its own kind of testimony. The council did not dissolve in that moment. Institutions do not dissolve in moments, but something fundamental shifted in the architecture of the room, a load-bearing assumption giving way, and everyone present felt it. The formal hearings began 3 days later. They lasted 3 weeks. Sarah testified for 7 of those days, presenting 11 years of documentation with the systematic precision that had made her an invisible workhorse of the Northern surveys, and that now made her an unmovable foundation of the case. Every anomaly she had recorded, every report she had submitted, and that had been ignored, every correlation between her findings and the seal's documented suppression of the land's natural function. The Boundary Compact's legal standing was established on day 4 by 3 separate analyses, one by an external territorial scholar Elder Vance had brought in over Elder Halveth's. Objection. The Founding Council's original proceedings were entered into evidence on day 8 and read aloud in full, which was an experience that Sarah observed with her professional attention and noted produced visible discomfort in a number of the older generation attendees who had grown up on a version of PAC history that had not included this particular chapter. Calum testified on days 11 and 12 in the deliberate, careful language of someone who had reclaimed speech recently and used it precisely. He described 300 years of the Northern Boundary's condition. He described what the seal had prevented him from maintaining, and the specific costs of that prevention to the territory over the centuries. He described the night she had crossed the boundary. He described, in language that was plain and exact, and that she heard from her seat in the witness gallery with something she had decided to continue categorizing as professional interest, what it had been like when she had placed her hands on the marks for the first time after 300 years, and what it had meant. The PAC was, by the end of the hearings, substantially different in its understanding of its own history than it had been at the beginning. This is what happens when a truth has been held in a system long enough. When it finally emerges, it does not just answer the question it was sealed against. It reorganizes everything around the question, reshapes the context, requires that many other assumptions be re-examined. The elders who had known about the bear and said nothing faced a formal review of their own, which Sarah had included in her case because she had been thorough. Elder Halveth retired before the review concluded. Elder Vance was appointed interim head of the council. 3 of the other 4 seats were restructured as part of a governance reform that Sarah had also outlined in her case, because she believed, as a professional matter, that you did not solve a problem by addressing only its most recent symptom. The Boundary Compact was formally reinstated as foundational territorial law on the last day of the hearings. Calum Dry was formally recognized as Northern Boundary Keeper, and Sarah Voss was formally recognized as something that had not had a name in the Ashevale record system before, because the record system had not previously acknowledged that the position existed. Boundary Witness. A permanent and protected position, with full documentation access, full survey authority, and the explicit mandate to submit reports that were required by law to be read and responded to within 30 days of submission. 47 reports. 312 years. One woman who showed up every day and mapped the evidence even when no one was reading it. She was given, along with the official recognition, a formal apology from the interim counsel for 11 years of ignored documentation, which was read aloud in the hall by Elder Vance, and which Sarah received standing, with her hands at her sides and her expression professionally neutral, and which she noted in her personal record that evening, not under the heading of vindication, because vindication was not the point, but under the heading of accurate record. The record now said what had actually happened. That was the thing she had been working toward. Calum found her that evening sitting on the steps of the archive building, which was where she often went when she needed to think, and sat down next to her, close enough that their shoulders were touching in a way that was the most natural thing in the world, and also the specific thing that had been building through 17 days in the forest, and 3 weeks of formal proceedings, like a tide that knew exactly where it was going. She was aware of the warmth. She had been aware of the warmth for 35 days. She had documented it carefully, and had chosen not to reach any conclusions about it that she could not support with evidence. "I owe you something," Calum said. "You do not," Sarah said, which was accurate. The compact established no debt between witness and keeper. It established mutual obligation, which was different. "I know," he said. "I want to give you something anyway." She looked at him, sideways, with the quality of attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand fully. He was looking at the archive building, at the lit windows where she could see the, movement of the night archivist going about the late evening cataloging. His profile in the lamplight from the windows had the quality of something that had always been there, that she had been mapping around without knowing it. And she thought about the compact's language about boundary witnesses and the territories they documented, about the way the land had been trying for 3 centuries to communicate an absence. And she thought about 11 years of work that had been, it turned out, always leading somewhere specific. And she thought about trust, which was the thing she was most careful with, which was the thing she had built with him in the old forest, through 15 days of sleet and granite and silence and presence. And she decided that trust was not a conclusion that required more evidence. She had the evidence. She had always had the evidence. She just had not known what it was evidence for. "All right," she said. He turned to look at her, and she looked back. And what happened then was not dramatic in the way that things in stories are dramatic. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, in the same way he had done in the clearing on the 8th day. The enormous, careful weight of it, the warmth moving through her skin. And she turned her hand over and held it, and felt the boundary between them resolve along lines that had been there from the beginning. The marks on his arms were fading, not vanishing, just resolving into something quieter, the seal giving way to the underlying pattern, what the marks had been before they had been chains. She traced one of them with her free hand, the same gesture she had made in the cold archive room 6 weeks before, and he watched her do it with those eyes, and she felt the warmth of the territory beneath her feet, the full living presence of the northern spine that was, for the first time in 300 years, complete. "I have 47 reports that were not read," she said. "I will read every one of them," he said. She believed him. She had very good instincts about what was true. 5 years later, the Northern Territories had been remapped completely, the official survey record revised to match the territory as it actually existed. a project that Sarah had undertaken with the thoroughness it deserved, and that had produced in the process documentation of 14 previously unrecorded ecological systems, 3 ancient territorial agreements that had bearing on current boundary law, and a comprehensive archive of the land's own history, stretching back to the period before any pack had occupied it. The archive had been reorganized under Sarah's oversight, and was now indexed in a system that actually worked, which she knew because she had built the system, and because the reports submitted to the council were consistently read and responded to within the mandatory 30-day window, which she verified personally every quarter. Calem's restoration of the northern boundary function had produced measurable changes in the territory within the first year. The anomalies Sarah had been documenting resolved one by one as the keeper's presence re-established the land's natural calibration. The drainage patterns improved, the old growth density recovered in areas that had been slowly degrading, the cold black rivers ran clear in seasons when they had previously run clouded. The pack wolves who patrolled the north reported that the territory felt different, which they said with the Yaugbi, slight unease of people describing something they did not have previous vocabulary for. And Sarah noted their descriptions in her ongoing survey record and did not tell them that what they were feeling was the land breathing normally for the first time in 3 centuries, because she was not sure they were ready for that much context. Elder Vance, who had become full council head after the governance restructuring, had turned out to be exactly as willing to actually govern as she had hoped, which was to say moderately willing, which in the context of what she had experienced before counted as an extraordinary improvement. She worked with him on the boundary law revisions, which were completed in year 2, and on the historical record commission that formally documented the founding council's actions and incorporated that documentation into the public territorial history, which was completed in year 3, and which she considered the most significant work of her professional life up to that point, because accurate record was the foundation of everything else. She and Calem lived in the north, as was appropriate for a keeper and a witness whose territory was the north. They had a structure near the spine that Sarah had designed, and that Calem had built, which was a division of labor that worked well for both of them. His capacity for large physical work, and her capacity for structural planning, being complementary in the specific and functional way that all the best partnerships are. She kept her field journal. He kept his own record, a keeper's log in the old tradition that documented the territory's condition in the language of someone with a direct sensory connection to it. And their 2 records together formed a documentation of the northern boundary that was more comprehensive than anything the Ashevale archive had ever held. She was mapping the eastern ridge one morning in the spring of year 5, 5 years and 3 weeks after she had first crossed the boundary line, when she came to a section of the territory she had documented extensively before, but that had shifted in the way the old forest sometimes shifted, not through geological process, but through the land's own ongoing adjustment to being cared for, and she found a clearing she had not seen before, knew not in the geological sense, but in the sense that the land had made space for something that had not been there previously. She stood in it for a long time, reading it with the full fluency of her developed boundary sense, and felt the particular quality of attended space, a place that had been prepared. She noted it in the field journal. She would tell Calem when she got back. He would know what it was for, because he had been reading this land for a great deal longer than she had, and his knowledge and her documentation together had always produced more than either produced alone. She took out her compass and her notebook, and she began to map it, standing in the new clearing in the spring light with the old trees around her, and the spine rising to the north, and the whole living, breathing territory spreading in every direction as far as her expanded sense could reach. And she felt, as she had felt every day for 5 years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the thing. The specific and irreplaceable thing that all the documentation and all the patience and all the careful invisible work had been leading toward. Not the formal recognition, not the legal victories, not even the truth made public record, though all of those things mattered. The thing itself was this: standing in the right place, doing the right work, known. That is the end of this story. But before you go, I want you to sit with something, because I think this story deserves that. Sarah Voss submitted 47 reports over 11 years, and not one of them was read by anyone with the power to act on them. And she kept writing them anyway, because the work was real regardless of the audience. And Kylem Dry waited 300 years in a forest at the edge of a territory he had sworn to protect, without language, without form, without the ability to ask for help. And he kept waiting because the alternative was to leave the boundary unwitnessed, and the boundary did not deserve that. These two people found each other because they were both, independently, committed to the same thing, showing up for the work even when no one was watching. And I think that is one of the most honest things I know about love. It looks like patience. It looks like documentation. It looks like someone who keeps crossing the boundary even when the protocol says not to, because something on the other side has been waiting long enough. Thank you for being here for this one. If this story moved you, hit that like button, because it helps more people find stories like this. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And leave me a comment, because I read them, every single one. And the conversation that happens in the comments of this channel is one of my favorite things about making it. Tell me what you thought. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me which part of this story you are still thinking about. I will see you in the next one.